Taking a softer stance on coal and fossil fuels. The latest draft from the COP26 summit waters down language on phasing out subsidies for those industries, but it retains a core demand for countries to return to the negotiating table next year, with stronger pledges to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Questions about finance also loom over last-ditch negotiations in Glasgow.
A race for a climate deal as the clock ticks down to the end of COP26. Negotiators will only have until the end of the day to iron out details of a final pact, which will serve as a roadmap to avoid catastrophic global warming.
When we reach this point in a COP, you essentially have room after room of negotiators sitting around tables, looking at documents on screen and going line by line and word for word. And this is really tough stuff. They often go through the night trying to come to areas of compromise on these texts.
The goal to cap warming at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels is still out of reach. The world is on track to warm by 2.7 degrees based on current promises. Negotiators are hoping to impose new requirements that could force countries to hike their pledges in the future.
How can you all come to Glasgow, say you're working to keep 1.5 degrees in sight and not have an outcome that is ambitious and equitable?
The people united will never be defeated.
A latest draft also waters down tough talk on the fossil fuel industry. But one of the summit's biggest flashpoints, even after 2 weeks of talks, is money. There's been anger going into the talks after richer nations failed to make good on a promise to deliver $100 billion a year for poorer, climate-vulnerable nations. But the real cost for allowing the Earth to heat up could be much higher than previously estimated. The UN has suggested it will require trillions to cope with the effects of climate change on droughts, flooding, and heat waves.
Live now to Glasgow with Laura Makin-Isherwood. Laura, how much of a setback is the change in the tone on fossil fuels and coal?
Well, look, we always knew that finding consensus on that was probably going to be quite difficult, but we knew that the aim of this summit was to try to find agreement between all of the near 200 nations here on fossil fuel plans, because, of course, that industry is one of the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases to the Earth's atmosphere. Without it, without that speed at which those coal-fired power plants and other use of various fossil fuels are phased out, that means that the risk of actually hitting that 1.5 degree warming target is now on life support, says the UN's Secretary General Antonio Guterres. So while we may come to the end of this summit with some sort of deal arranged, potentially, it's perhaps not exactly what the UK presidency was really hoping for.
Well, with so much still at stake, are these talks expected to perhaps run into overtime?
Well, the final gavel was expected to fall in around 6 hours' time here in Glasgow. That's the scheduled sort of programme of discussions, but negotiators are still sitting around another draft document that's been put in place, trying to find where they can move or perhaps adjust their expectations so that they can come to this agreement. And there are plenty thinking that they might not hit that 6 o'clock UK time deadline, and it could in fact continue overnight, maybe into tomorrow, and there's no real sort of sense of exactly when this will end. We do know that countries have already agreed to come back yearly now to try to think about their emissions targets, to think about the effects of global warming. But, you know, this is going to be an ongoing and long-running conversation, particularly if we don't meet that 1.5 degree target, because the effects of climate change will be felt more fiercely in those developing nations that are already experiencing the likes of desertification, drought and sea level change. And then the move is really going to have to be looking at money then, the amount that is offered to those nations to put in place mitigation projects so that they can live in a world with climate change affecting them.
Laura Makin-Isherwood, watching negotiations in Glasgow. Thank you.